This is Hunt Nebraska, the official podcast for insight into Nebraska's hunting and shooting sports community. Be sure to give us a follow on Facebook, our space for sharing stories, information, tips, and techniques. Now, Hunt Nebraska.
Welcome back to everybody out there. We appreciate you listening to us, inviting in to your office, your home, your car, your truck, wherever you might be listening to us or watching us on YouTube. Thanks for doing that. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, not only for this, but also jump over to Facebook on Hunt Nebraska and give that a follow so we can keep you up to date on all the things going on in our hunting and shooting world here in the great state of Nebraska. We have a guest today. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see that already. We got Hunter behind the boards as we search for one Kayla. She's out and about someplace getting ready for whatever festivities are going on this weekend. Hunter, have you seen her recently?
She's been in and out. She's getting ready.
Pretty busy.
She said she is shooting this weekend. I got that out of her. So.
Oh, good. You've got me, Hershey, doing some talking here, but we've got our guest back in the studio, back here at the Hunt Nebraska cabin, Luke Meduna, our big game program manager. How you doing, Luke?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Hey, always good to have you. I know you're a busy guy. Got your tree stands all trimmed up, food plots looking nice, field edges cut, deer trails probably mowed so they don't have to work too hard at it.
I actually did spray a few of them this year for access.
There you go. Something I've noticed, guys, is that I started using machete a little bit more to clear the path so I can see it, and two, I'm not as loud making the crunching noise through the underbrush getting to my tree stand for archery. But darn it, if sometimes first the raccoons and then the deer start following that same path through the vegetation, and pretty soon I realize that might be my best hunting trails when I'm walking in now, so I got to cut a different one.
You're paving new trails, Hershey, for wildlife.
Who would have thought it would be that easy?
I've seen some of that same thing where I cut a trail in, getting into one place, and the deer just all the same thing.
Path of least resistance. Yeah. I know my son, probably his first year, he actually harvested 2 with his bow and arrow before he ever got one with a firearm. And we set up a little pop-up blind, and there was a spot where I knew they kind of traveled down along this creek and decided, you know what, I'm going to give them a little bit better shooting window in there. So I can't remember what tall plant was in there, and pretty much just a cane, and went in there and hacked out a path. And sure enough, the deer he ended up shooting not only walked past it, turned, came right up that. I mean, I cut it hours before it was out there. And he just saw it as hey, look at that. There's a new way through here. But that's all sorts of fun. Now, that's not what we're going to be talking about here all the time. We're going to have to really hit you up with some hard questions because we get into deer season. I know there's some archers already out there as we speak about it. Some folks getting the rifle sighted in, maybe buying something new, putting new glass on top of it or whatever. Even the muzzleloaders are probably getting a little bit excited. Especially if they're looking for number 11 caps. Those are hard to find right now. But first question, we started this tradition just today as far as asking each and every one of our guests, including ourselves, when you're headed to the deer woods or on any hunt, you're rushing out of the house. Question 1 is, what is your go-to grab for breakfast when you're in a hurry? What's the go-to grab? And the second part of that is, what do you put in your thermos? What are you carrying out there? If you're going to be sitting in the tree stand or ground blind for a period of time, what's the beverage of choice?
Well, the answer to your first one's always been Pop-Tarts for me.
Yes, I'm a believer.
That's the easiest one. And they're noisy, though.
They
can
be.
Them if you're in the tree stand.
I've usually eaten those on the way.
Yeah,
what I do, I call it the deer hunter's breakfast, is you take that Pop-Tart and that Mylar or whatever that sleeve is, toss it on the defrost and turn it up. Then it warms it up a little bit so it's not super crumbly, and kind of a warm start to the day.
I suppose.
What's your preferred flavor?
Cherry. That's about the only thing.
Really? Yeah. I'm partial to s'mores. Cherry's pretty good. Strawberry might be a little bit better.
Brown sugar, cinnamon. We got to get the stats on what their flavors are that they sell. See where
for me,
we
it's been almost 100% cherry for about 20 to 30 years.
And now they've got limited time flavors. They got special editions. I'm sure the Halloween ones will be out here soon. But you stuck with cherry the whole time.
Stubborn.
Really? Just easy.
Yeah.
Easy to choose. What about you, Hunter? What's your go-to grab?
Depends on the season. Archery season, I'm probably a granola bar, something quick and quick and easy. Firearm season, though, we've always got a bunch of venison jerky made up, and that's a good snack even early in the morning. Get you going a little bit. Yeah.
Go-to drink.
In the morning, it's gonna be coffee with creamer.
Me too. I wish I liked coffee though. I really do.
Well, that's why I said creamer. It's not coffee. It's mostly creamer.
I'm one of those. I've gone down that route, and Hunter's heard this story. I drink coffee because it's got caffeine. And there's spots here in Nebraska where there is not a cold version of caffeine. There's not a Coke nearby. There's not a Dr. Pepper to be had. So there's almost always coffee. So I trained myself to drink it. Then I started, like you said, putting in the cream and started out with some of those flavors. And then I remembered how much I like milk and cream. And pretty soon it was just like, if they could caffeinate milk, I would really be happy.
Yeah.
But at the same token, simple, especially now that you can program your coffee pot to go off and be ready.
Yeah.
Before you run out the door. That is handy.
Yeah, I've got a similar background to coming to drink coffee. My wife, I'm a Mountain Dew drinker.
Amen.
And my wife started me drinking coffee so I could quit Mountain Dew. So now I drink coffee and Mountain Dew.
Made it worse.
Yeah.
And maybe you're like me. I can't drink cold coffee. It's got to be at least warm.
Yeah.
And ice or tea has to be iced. I can't go the other way for whatever reason. So
now, deer hunting, you just drink it on the way, or do you bring it into the field with you?
I take it in the field with me. I've got one of those wonderful, and I know they should sponsor the show because I'm going to push them really hard. They're those thermos cups that are kind of part thermos, part drinking cup. They've got a seal on them, so you got to push a button to drink it, let go of it, and it's leak proof. And it keeps it nice and warm, so I can, if I'm drinking on the way to the field, that sounds bad. Am I sipping my coffee on the way to the field? That's ready to go. I toss it in the day pack and walk it right out there. I don't have to worry about smelling like coffee or spilling that hot liquid on myself. And then it's right there. I can grab it and drink it and go. I don't have to worry about having two parts.
I've done it both ways. I usually try to finish it before I get into the field. Ooh. I'm a little superstitious, wandering on scent, and I don't know if there's anything out there on deer catching the scent of coffee or not.
But I think they like Folgers. Maxwell House, maybe not so much.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. Is there any research on that? We'll have to figure that out.
I don't know. That's a whole nother rabbit hole.
I'm sure they can smell it, but whether or not they ever associate it with danger is probably a different story.
Question.
That's an excellent question, though. All right, so we got coffee and Pop-Tarts. We're going to jump into deer. I mean, we are a deer state nowadays, and everyone's wondering what the deer season is going to be like. Like I said, archers are already out there. But first of all, let's start with the herd. How are we doing? It's been a drought year, which makes a lot of us Nebraskans a little bit nervous.
Yeah, we're so far so good. We've had very few reports of EHD. I mean, that's the primary concern this time of year. We're starting to get a few trickle in now that people are getting out into the field. Most of the anecdotal stuff I've seen from people, kind of self-reporting on Facebook or anywhere, they've walked up and down their creeks trying to look and haven't seen anything yet. So, fingers crossed, but, this is the time. If it's going to show up, it's going to show up. So,
now deer build a little bit of resistance to it, correct? I remember, 2012 we had it really hit pretty much statewide. Except there was a little pocket down in the southwest.
Yeah, southwest wasn't impacted by it virtually at all.
And if I remember right, the anecdotal suggestion was they got hit by EHD a different time, earlier, not necessarily, just a year or two before, but several years before, and perhaps they had a little bit more resistance to it.
Yeah, there's some of that, and some of the science isn't entirely clear on that, or at least that I'm aware of. But, they can have some resistance. If they survive it once or have a lesser case of it, they can seem to do pretty well or not be as impacted by it in coming years.
So what's the possibility we're kind of getting to that? Because we've had some couple of dry years back to back.
Yeah. And last year was in some parts of the state we had moderate impacts, northeast seemed to be the worst. But we'll see how it plays out this year. It's kind of hard, a little hard to forecast. Yeah,
that's part of the fun, isn't it? Just not knowing what curveball you're going to get thrown.
Yep.
So this year, the reports that are coming in, you said they're pretty localized
we're talking
and
like 10 total
10
so
total.
far. Yeah.
Are they, regionally, are they kind of spread out, or are they?
Yeah, I mean, we had one officer say he's taken about 5 here north of Lincoln, and then the Northeast District's taken a handful, and that's kind of it so far. We've had, with our collared antelope last year, we picked up a bunch during this time. We had like 13 of our collared antelope die during September and early October.
13 out of how many?
At that point, it was like 60 of them were still
60,
alive.
okay.
And we had one die here a couple weeks ago that, kind of unknown. We'll test it. It got samples submitted, so we'll see what the results come on that. But it hasn't been the rash of them like we saw last year. So.
Well, and weather always plays into it. I think back to last year, and I sitting in the tree stand with my bow. I could not believe how long the leaves stayed on the trees. We kind of had I don't want to call it a late fall because we had some nice weather in there, but things just didn't work against those trees, and they held onto those leaves for seemed like an
forever.
Extended length of time, and then we kind of stayed warm into November and December. So weather's always a curveball, and I remember, most of the hunters last year talking about not seeing very many deer statewide. In some parts, that was by design. Other parts was probably just change the landscape, that type of stuff. But then come spring turkey hunting, being in some of those same spots that I was bow hunting, and I saw a good number of deer early, and then it just kind of dried up after that. But being in some of those same spots as spring turkey hunting, I probably saw more deer turkey hunting than I have in some time.
Yeah.
Just shifting across the landscape, making use of what's available, and hey, I'm still hunting the same tree stands that I put up each and every year in the same spots.
Yeah, and we did see that last year. Even the last few years, whether it was the flooding, in 2019, where that changes some of the landscape, and last year and this year with droughts, those deer are going to adjust to what the habitat conditions are. They'll move to the uplands, if they need to, or move to where there's water. If the uplands are dry, they're going to head towards where there's water and food and cover. And
I got to assume, I think we've all three been out. Water, I think, is going to be key, especially early on in this fall.
Yeah, as warm as it is.
I mean, a lot of the creeks and stuff.
103 yesterday here.
Oh, don't bring that up. Doesn't it feel nice out there, though? You're exactly right. A new record here in the capital city of 103, and today, I think, did we make 70 yet?
It's about 70 right now.
I'll take it. I will definitely take it. But I've noticed that a lot of places where I've had to, figure out where I was going to cross the creek, now I don't think there's any creek to cross in those spots. And where the deep holes are, and I've kind of moved a little bit more towards those, realizing that's probably where they're going to have to come and get drink.
Yep.
In my scouting so far, I've certainly seen more sign closer to water. And I mean, with it being so dry, it makes it a little tough to, see some of that sign, some of those trails too, but definitely more activity, at least in my experience so far this year. And I reading a lot of the forums, that's what I'm seeing too. Yep. Water is key.
Got to be huge. And I don't know what took place though, but the acorns on the ground are just phenomenal in some spots.
Yeah, it's a good acorn year.
So that might help or might hurt depending on how many oaks you have in your timber and then across the fence and all that. So, which is a lot of fun. But deer hunting, big game hunting in general. I mean, it's one of those things. We're going to dive into big deer. We're going to talk about antlers. You can't talk about deer, especially whitetail deer, without talking about antlers when it comes to hunting. I don't know any deer hunter that absolutely is against the idea of shooting a big buck. Have you met many in all the public meetings that you've come across?
No, you get people that say, "Oh, I'm just a meat hunter," but there's very few people that are going to pass up a buck or a big buck when he walks in front of them.
And you actually did some survey study with that, some photos from trail cam pictures of deer. You had a really good idea of the age and all that, and do you shoot, do you not shoot?
Yep, we did whitetails 2 years ago. We're talking about our deer hunter survey that we, I guess it's an annual survey since we've done it 3 years in a row now, 3 years. So 2 years ago, we put whitetails. I actually used a bunch of pictures from trail cameras that came off one of the WMAs that I used to manage when I was in North Platte. So I had thousands of pictures of these deer over multiple years. So I had a pretty good idea. Some of them probably had names too. So I knew these deer really quite well. Actually, one of the deer was actually in the survey twice.
Really?
Once is a 3-year-old, and once is a 6-year-old.
Oh, wow.
And so looking at hunter per preferences on, would they harvest or, it's kind of a shoot, don't shoot situation, And so, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's definitely a correlation between age, antler size, and whether or not hunters are going to shoot them.
Yeah. But I dare say that for the most part, the average hunter, even here in a state like Nebraska, we dream about the big ones, but oftentimes we're happy with the biggest we see during the time we're out there. And I know some other states have kind of dove into that. I don't know that Nebraska has, but for the most part, people are we're opportunistic. We'll take advantage of what venison pops up in front of us for the freezer, and it's harder to go without than it is to not pull the trigger.
Yeah.
In that survey you did you just do a general question on whether they would harvest that deer, or did you put it into season constraints or time, like this is the last day of the season, would you shoot?
I basically it gave them the same question for each one, and it was something along the lines of, given all legal and ethical constraints aside, would you harvest this deer? And it was yes, maybe, and no. And that was it.
Okay.
So it was up to them, is it a deer you would ever shoot, or, is it not? Because, you start throwing too many constraints in it, last day, first day.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
muddies the water, yeah.
Yeah. And so...
Always adds to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's certainly my perspective going into deer season. I want to fill the freezer, but I also want to shoot a big buck. Yeah. So, at the beginning of the seasons, I'm probably going to be more selective than I am on, the last day of firearm season or something like that. But
you hear me talk about the irony of big game hunting, and it goes to turkeys as well, is you dream about that time all year long. I mean, you're just pumped up for that time of the season. I can't wait to get out there. I'm going to spend so much time hunting. I'm going to do it, whatever it takes. I'm going to be out there from, pre-dawn to dark plus some. I'm just going to do whatever it takes. And the first thing that we often do when we get out there is like, boy, I hope I see something. If I see something, I hope it's within range. If it's in range, I think I'm going to shoot it. And it's kind of like you do that, and there goes that tag. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you waited all this time so you can end it quickly. For some. I mean, there, like you said, beginning of the season, you kind of maybe let more things walk than towards the end as you're seeing fewer, perhaps. But it is kind of the dichotomy or the irony of the big game hunters. We dream about doing it for months and months, and then it's kind of, if doesn't happen right away, especially that first morning Saturday in November, it's just like, oh man, where are the deer?
Yeah.
The season's 8 hours old, and I haven't had a shot
with
yet.
Patience.
We really do. And the other thing I'm going to toss out here is our agency, Nebraska Game and Parks, who we all three work for. We aren't necessarily into just creating huge deer, trophy deer. We're here to make healthy deer populations.
Yep. Yeah. We really don't focus a whole lot on trophy quality or any of that. We do collect age data in our harvest, so it gives us an idea. But that's not our overwhelming goal. And there's no state that's really, has that as a major goal. I mean, there's some states that look at it trying to make sure that they aren't over harvesting like young bucks. And, in some regards looking at age structure if they've harvested or if their harvest is really high.
Look at our prairie grouse. We're always asking prairie grouse hunters to submit wings to figure out, is it this year's hatch bird or is it an older mature bird? And we're not doing that because for management of trophy prairie chickens, we're doing that to see what kind of hatch rate there was, what kind of harvest is out there, and knowing, all right, this is what we're going into this hunting season with.
Yep.
You can't ever end a hunting season with more hatch birds than you started with.
Right.
And so we use that in our management decisions. But again, like I said, we all dream about it, but at the same token, it's not something we manage for. But it's a thing that causes a lot of conversation.
Oh, for sure.
Throughout the year, and it's only going to build from here through the deer seasons. So we're going to kind of dive into that because there's been a lot of things I think that one or two folks say, and it gets repeated enough that all of a sudden it's got to be gospel. It's got to be some science behind it. How can I grow bigger deer? And that's probably what we should label this podcast: How to Grow Bigger Deer by Luke Meduna, Big Game Program Manager.
Well, it's a simple recipe. Don't shoot small ones if you want big ones. Done.
And we're going to come back to that real fast and maybe very often, to be quite honest with you, because one of the things that I hear every year is, it wasn't as big of deer I saw. You're seeing the picture online, on a forum, on a message board, Facebook. They're showing it to you on your phone, and the first thing they say is, well, it's not the biggest deer I ever shot. but it just was weird. It had to come out of the population. We had to cull this buck.
Yeah.
And I, for many years, have kind of been under the impression that, man, there's folks that believe in being able to cull those genetics out of a population, but is there the science behind it to prove that it actually works? So let's jump in right there. Let's talk about that. Antlers are what? Two things. Genetics.
Yeah, three things.
Three things. Genetics, environment.
Yeah.
What's the third one?
Food and age.
Food and age. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that kind of environment, I was tossing food in there right there. So walk us through this, the genetic part of it.
That's probably the most unknown part of it. That's going to be the most complicated. For one, roughly half of the genetics for a buck's antlers come from mom. And so when you're looking at your deer herd, you can't see the genetic potential of half of your deer herd to start with. The other side of it, there's been some research, and it's a great example that was done out of the Texas A&M Kingsville on the Comanche Ranch, where they had 3 different treatments where they had 4,000 some captures of 2,500 deer, and had 3 treatments where they had one where they intensely culled any buck that didn't have any yearling buck that didn't have at least either 3 or 4 points, and then they had goals for age classes 2, 3, and 4, and 5. If they didn't meet these minimums, they culled. And when they were doing that, they were culling about 93% of the bucks that they captured in that. So they were only letting the top of the top live
according to their standards.
According to their standards. They had a second one where they didn't make that assumption on the young bucks, but they still, like for the 4 and 5 year old bucks, they waited till they were 4 and 5 to evaluate them. So they were removing them from the herd at that point, and then they had a control area where they didn't do anything. They found absolutely the intense treatment. They completely crashed the buck population to the point that they were having incomplete breeding. They messed up their deer herd. Staggered fawning. It was a complete mess. The other one where they were the moderate treatment had no effect at all on antler size, where they're comparing 4.5-year-old bucks pre-treatment to 4.5-year-old bucks post-treatment. There was no change there. What they did do there was they actually took all genetic samples on all of those to where they could tell lineages and who fathered who within those herds. What they found was that the antler size of the buck, they established what they referred to as a breeding value, which meant the antler size of a particular buck's offspring.
Okay, so dads. They rated dads.
Yeah, they rated dads based upon the son's antler size, and they found no correlation between dad antlers and his son's antlers.
Isn't that amazing?
In the study. So the big antlered bucks didn't produce big sons.
Which is just, it goes to contrary to what, most of us think about, isn't it?
Yeah,
let that big one go and breed, and then I'll harvest him because his genetics are passed on.
And especially in an ag state where we're so used to, animal husbandry, and we think, it just makes sense. We control it. But that's the big part of it is in a wild herd, we have no control over hardly any of it.
I remember, right, one of the dad bucks, if you will, that ranked the highest actually had an antler set that he probably would have been culled if he wasn't in, I think he was in the control group.
Yeah,
where they didn't do any culling at all.
I think, it was like his biggest antler size was like 143 inches or something like that.
Never made to 150. And which is interesting because he would have been culled in the other ones, and yet all of his offspring were what we'd call big deer, to be quite honest with you. And I think that goes to two things. One, like you said, shows that mom might have just a little bit more edge in some of this, and some of the health of mom going into it, which we can get into here in a bit. But also, that it probably takes just the right circumstances. Genetics is a piece of it, the environment, the food, the age to get to that. It's not every deer given full opportunity is even going to make it to that magic number or whatever it was. I think in this study it was that 150 inch or right around it. Yeah. So they're kind of special deer to begin with.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're definitely, a buck that's going to get to 160 to meet the Boone and Crockett minimums is a rare deer to start with. Back to our deer hunter survey where I had my pictures of our whitetail bucks. The one that I used is the 3 and the 6-year-old.
Yeah.
He was something at 6 was like 140 inches. Like he wasn't some just giant buck, and that was probably part of the, I don't know if there's necessarily a curveball within that, but there was a significant portion of the hunter population that, wasn't interested in shooting that buck despite the fact that he had a body like a horse in the picture, and so yeah, there's, you've got the Shaquille O'Neals of the world, and you got the Spud Webbs of the world, and they're still basketball players.
And
they're still deer.
They both can dunk.
Yep.
And maybe we should even take a step back from here and saying, our agency's goal is healthy deer populations, sustainable deer populations, and antlers in and of themselves aren't the only measurement of that. I mean, they can be an indicator at times, but they're not fully guarantee. All right, he's got big antlers. That must be one healthy son of a gun.
Yeah,
and that little guy, not so much.
Yeah, and for the most part, we don't see the effects that they see across or in some other parts of the nation where they can be food limited, where it impacts body size and antler size. The examples of that are like the Black Hills of South Dakota. If you've ever seen the deer up there, they're tiny. For a long time, they thought they were a different species of deer. They've done the similar study looking at the antler size of deer down in the Mississippi Delta, where you've got fertile grounds versus areas that aren't as fertile, where you just have different. The deer look different and don't have to be very, very far apart. Antler size, body size, and what they've done there is they've captured deer from those areas, take them to a pen, and then rear them all the same to see what they grow up into. And what they found in those studies is those initial deer, that first generation that comes from there, they still look like their parents. But it's when you get to generations 2 and generation 3 that they all start to look the same. They start to kind of meet in the middle, or they all, the bucks that, or the bucks that whose lineage was from, say the Black Hills or the poor nutritional area of Mississippi. They once they're on a good diet,
you start to see that transform.
They start looking like their brothers from their neighboring range, and what they refer to that to is the maternal effect. So if you're feeding, if the does are getting fed, and for a deer to all of a sudden get fed really well, it makes no sense for him to all of a sudden just bulk up and have 20% bigger body size and 20% bigger antlers, because next year your food may be sparse again, and then you got to feed that body. So it's generally it's generational. It's like, man, if a doe has good food her whole life, it triggers some genetic changes to go, hey, we should probably grow a little bit bigger body to take advantage of this food we have. And so that's where you get the regional differences in body size and antler size there. And that said, we really don't see that here in Nebraska. We've got really pretty plentiful food across our range. There's probably some differences east to west, but.
And I've heard that, and you mentioned with that study down in Texas again, where they were extensively culling deer and taking out about 90% of their bucks at times, which related to some more spread out fawning, which means does were bred a little bit later. I got to assume health in those does probably questionable, because I've heard at times, what mom's going through while those fawns are still inside, impacts them as well. If she's malnourished, they're malnourished.
Yeah,
it's going to take some time to make that up. And I'm guessing, usually food's not the limiting factor here in the most part in Nebraska. And the weather, like you said, pretty mild winters most of the time. But droughts probably have to be in there somewhere, a little extra stress on mom.
Yeah, and that'll have a year-to-year impact. But as far as, across the landscape, year over year, it's probably not going to have quite as big of an impact. I guess I should say that there's, we probably saw some anecdotal stuff following the 2012 drought, where those fawns that were born that year, or those bucks that grew up, that spent their first year of their life in that drought. We did notice that those bucks tended to, when we were working check stations in 13 and 14, there were some bucks there that you'd come through and you look at their antlers and you're like, well, that's got to be a 2-year-old deer. And you're like, holy cow, he's 4. You know, when you look at the teeth, and some of that is like there's no question, and he's not a 2-year-old.
He's not. Yep.
And so there's definitely some of that. There's probably some of that, but by and large, that's not been well documented. If that occurs, it probably takes a real exceptional event like maybe we saw in 12.
Yeah.
So
hopefully we can avoid that.
Earlier, you were talking a little bit on some of the other states' management and, you know, your mandatory antler point restrictions. You know, with this study and some of those, I mean, most of those are basically yearling buck restrictions, and you know, that's just to adjust the age. I know Wisconsin has a 3-inch minimum on their antlered deer, and they've got some of the highest harvest rates of young deer in the nation. Despite that, so I mean, is that something that states are successful with, or is that?
Yeah,
you know,
I mean the and we're kind of talking two different things where, you know, and like in Nebraska, you know, for it to be considered or it can still be considered an antlerless if it's, you know, got antlers, you know, 6 inches or shorter, and in Wisconsin it's 3 inches. That's a separation in the designation of buck versus doe legally. But in the South, there's a lot of states that institute antler point restrictions, you know, 3-point or 4-point rules, and that's the main intent there is to protect yearling bucks from harvest, to get them to 2.5, just so the large majority of their harvest isn't that yearling buck age class, and that's simply to keep more bucks on the landscape and to have a better, more complete breeding, you know, for their does and their entire herd.
Right.
So you don't have that staggered birth, those birth dates.
It's always interesting. Interesting, the different things that we try. And I know I'm fishing and hunting are different things. I understand that, but I also know that at times that what happens, we've seen in the fishing world, is the length minimums that we all grew up with, and that was kind of the gold standard at a time. In a pond, if you only harvest, 10-inch crappie, all of a sudden you realize I'm actually selecting against those fastest growing, most, some of the healthiest fish, because they're going to get there first.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, all the ones that take forever to get there are the ones that are spawning and adding more genetic material back into it. And pretty soon you've got all these slow weights on the fish. And I think that's where a lot of our fisheries, especially the high demand fish, you see these slot limits protecting not only the ones laying the eggs and stuff, but some of those that are above and beyond that. And it doesn't take long to make a 14-inch walleye, but it takes quite a bit to make a 18-inch walleye or a 20-inch walleye. And so a little bit more protection there, which is kind of interesting. Like you said, some states have tried different ways to do it, and there's probably been some anecdotal evidence that it works, especially where there's a lot of 1.5-year-old bucks being harvested. But do we see that much here in Nebraska? Of our antlered harvest, what do they generally make up, those 1.5-year-old bucks?
Right now it's between 20 and 25%, and so and we're among the Midwest states, we're one of the lowest. We're definitely towards the lower end of that, Kentucky and a couple other, I'm trying to think who the other one is that's right in there, but Kansas and Iowa don't do any age structure in their harvest, so we don't know where they're at. So we rank really quite well. The states that have instituted those antler point restrictions to reduce antler or yearling buck in the harvest are typically in that 60 and 80 and 90% yearling buck bucks make up, that percentage of a really high percentage of the harvest. So
the difference in your antler point restriction and your minimum length restriction for classification of a doe versus a buck, is that the antler point restriction is more of an age structure thing? The length restriction, is that more of an identification piece, or does it go into the age structure?
That's just a legal identification piece, right. So you can identify legally what's antlerless, so that somebody that, because it happens, guys will go up and, shoot what they think is a doe, and they walk up and it's got little 4-inch spikes, and so it's not penalizing those guys. They didn't intend to shoot. Right.
It's funny differences in lengths for that between states, and if there's other intent there in terms of
that's really all it is. No, they're not trying to protect some yearling bucks versus others, because it's just a protection for misidentification. So you're not writing somebody a ticket that you don't need to.
Now, the one thing we do know with 100% certainty is that once you harvest a deer, they're not getting any bigger.
No,
other than in stories. If you talk to Jeff Rollinson, his deer always get bigger. Give them some time to season. I'm surprised a couple of them more aren't up on his wall. Those 1.5-year-old bucks he shot. No, I'm just kidding. But the same token, it's probably not having a huge impact. We want to, if you're thinking big bucks, like you said, you got to let them get to their maximum.
Yeah.
That maximum might not be huge, but the only way you're going to find out is to let them walk and see what they look like next year, and the year after, perhaps.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, and letting them get to that, at least 3.5. There's the research out there. They've also looked at that as you really can't tell a buck's full potential until he's at least 3.
And back to the culling idea is oftentimes by that time they've turned 3 or 4 years old. I mean, they've already passed on some genes already.
Yeah. There's a fair part of the breeding that happens with those younger age class bucks. It's not just a
numbers game, probably.
Yeah, it really is. They've found that in a bunch of research that all bucks are participating in the breeding of does. Older bucks tend to take a little higher proportion of the doe breeding, but the yearling bucks are still participating.
So which adds to that whole idea we can't play with genetics really well by just taking out a single individual at this time.
Yeah.
And I will say this before I forget is, hey, if that deer makes you excited, great.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree.
I'm there. I don't necessarily have a number in mind. I don't have they got to have this many points on one side. They don't, it's one of those things when I'm sitting in the tree stand, I know whether that deer is one I want to shoot or not by my reaction to it when it walks up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just like, boy, and I'm going to stick with that. I'm not going to make any apologies, and I hope that others are the same way, and I'm not going to judge what I would shoot and what I wouldn't shoot compared to what you want to shoot or pass up or anything like that. Whatever makes you happy, that's what we're out there for, is to secure some local protein and enjoy the time while we're out there, and the harvest is just icing on the cake. This is going to be kind of an odd question. What is the survival rate? I got to assume a 1.5-year-old buck. We make jokes about them all the time, especially during the rut, that their survivability, probably outside of hunters as well, isn't that great. They got to be one of the
they wander, they get hit
most
by cars.
likely to make mistakes.
Yeah. Yep. It's been a long time since we've had callers on deer in Nebraska, so I don't have. I'm not going to have real good data on that, but it's definitely lower than what those. You get through your first year, your odds of survival in the following years are going to be a little better.
Just better.
So, yeah.
Just a little bit wiser, a little bit more experience under the antler, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure.
So, all right, you mentioned the 3 things: genetics, environment, food.
Yeah, age and food, yeah.
And food, yeah. We talked a little age there. And you said the minimum for them to express their full potential, or you can tell a little bit more.
You can start telling what they're going to turn into by the time they get to the 3. But your max potential isn't 5, 6,
5 or 6,
7, somewhere in that range, and that varies by deer, of course. So yeah, and that's the big thing where the culling in Nebraska doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because by and large our herds aren't limited by food. We don't see that food limitation of what the deciduous forests in the east do, where you have browse lines and that. We've got crop fields, and we've got more food than well.
I always wondered why our good friends to the south would have these reports on mast, how the mast was coming off in the mountains and all that type of stuff, and they're just like, oh, that's cool, but I'm not squirrel hunting here.
Yeah.
In Wisconsin, did they keep track of mast and the trees and how they were doing?
I don't think so. I mean, you'd pay attention to it in the field, when you're out scouting and stuff. But I don't think as an agency they did any special reports on mass production that year.
I did not realize how important that is to not only the deer down there, but sometimes even some of their bear populations and things like that. And then it dawned on me that, boy, not every state's just full of corn and beans and hay fields and all that good stuff. So we hear a lot about, I'm going to toss this out, and there's probably a yes or no, it depends type answers. We see a lot of push in the supplemental feed side of things. And now I've never been fortunate enough to plant a food plot offside, a public hunting area or anything like that. But I do know at times if I want to mess around with those trail cameras, which I'm not really good at anyway, I'm usually tossing something out there to slow them down, at least to sniff a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of minerals or anything missing from a Nebraska deer's diet that's going to increase the antler size?
I can't imagine that there's a whole lot. Like I said, we've got pretty plentiful food. The other part of that, food abundance is just deer abundance. We don't have areas where we've got too many deer for the habitat, aside from depredation issues and all that. But that's an entirely different tolerance where in those situations, deer aren't eating themselves out of house and home like you see in the east, where the number of deer on the landscape is impacting the deer's own health. We don't have those issues here. There's probably a few things that you're slightly deficient at. I think most people, in the state that institute some sort of mineral program that, they come back 2 years later and they're saying, oh, I'm seeing more, we're seeing bigger bucks. And it's like, well, you're also quit shooting your young bucks too in that same time period. So you got to compare apples to apples. Is your 5.5-year-old buck now bigger than the 5.5-year-old buck, or your average 5.5-year-old buck prior to feeding? And nobody's done that. Look at that I've ever seen.
I don't think there's any argument that with certain supplemental, whether it's a block or mixes or whatever it is, even just food plots, there's an attraction. They work to attract deer. All of a sudden, you might be the spot they want to be because, this is easy pickings right here.
Yep, for sure.
And so you might be concentrating them, and there might be some deer that you hadn't even realized were around, passing in front of where your blind is, where your camera is, whatever it might be. And I think that can be part of it as well.
Yeah.
Is the attractant part of that? Amazing. It really is. As far as the benefit to the actual animal, and I know we hear some people, well, I'm helping the deer herd, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I'm guessing kind of negligible overall. Like you said, we do have deer that probably starve to death at certain times under certain conditions, but it's probably not near as much as we make it out to be.
But getting minerals in July isn't helping them from starving to death in the winter. That's the big thing. If you're wanting to impact and help your deer herd health, get out there with a chainsaw and do that type of work. That'll do far better than throwing stuff in a pile.
Yeah, and that attractants to me are more, a lot of hunters might think they're doing the health of that deer good, but maybe they're just seeing more deer as a result of that, and they link the two together.
Yeah, and there's some of that. And it's kind of the natural progression of deer hunting. We've all gotten more and more passionate about deer hunting over time, and so we want to take an active role in it. And whether it's putting out supplements or even the idea of culling, we've all got to be a deer manager on where we're at, and those are the. I guess I hesitate to use the phrase, but the low-hanging fruit, where you can be like, well, this is what I'm doing to help my deer herd. Whereas running a chainsaw, actually changing your habitat, doing those types of things, shooting the right number of does, those are hard things to figure out, when it comes to actually, managing deer, and those are the impactful things.
That's an excellent point, because I know, like I said early on, when we first started talking, is, we dream for that hunting season to roll around, and people have found ways to extend it. I think with trail cameras, and now you can sit at your desk and be at work and look at what deer are passing by. And then with the supplements, hey, now I got more deer passing by. I'm getting more pictures. I'm doing something here. Like you said, I'm helping them out. And we've turned it into a longer season. In fact, I'm sure I'm not alone in this. You guys probably know some folks as well. They're just as happy getting a picture of a nice deer or two than they are actually harvesting it. They put the picture up and show people, everyone else, and then they go out during deer season and just like they hardly sat at all. They were around the chili pot a little bit more than anybody else, but they got pictures of the deer that were around and all that.
Yeah.
So it just adds to the experience and maybe the excitement when you do.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Have things happen the right way. So. Well, that's kind of what I got. What else do we need to cover on this whole thing? How to make Nebraska deer bigger?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, is that we've seen, 20 years ago, our yearling buck harvest made up like 65 to 70% of our buck harvest. And our hunters have done that themselves, that, just that realization is he's not getting any bigger if I shoot him now. I'll pass him, and in that same time, we've kind of taught hunters to shoot does. So there's option, fill in the freezer, there's half your population can be used for that as well. And maybe you don't need to shoot that yearling buck for freezer meat. And so we've kind of, our hunters have done a great job in deciding, what buck it is that makes them happy. And our age structure has gone up as a result of that.
And that's what it's all about, kind of a mind shift there and that's what you're out there for. I guess the one thing I do have to throw out here, spike bucks. I see them every once in a great while here in Nebraska and other places I hunt. I assume they're probably a little bit more prevalent in other areas where, again, they don't have quite the situation and environment that our deer have. But still some debate. Worth harvesting, worth letting go and getting bigger. What happens in year 2 and 3 or second and third sets of antlers with a spike buck?
Most studies have shown that they end up catching up with their peers. You know, they end up being some of them, you know, exceed, some of them don't, you know, what their peers grow into, of that age class grow into be. A lot of that has to do with their antler size that first year. A lot of time has to do with their birth date. Okay. You know, a buck born earlier, you know, a fawn born earlier in the summer has more time to grow, more time to put on fat, you know, going into the winter. So in turn, you know, that turns into his antlers, you know, the next year. And, you know, by the time he's 18 months, 24 months old, they've all caught up, you know, and weight-wise and all that. You know, and especially here in Nebraska, most of those are going to be either bucks that were born, you know, typically to fawns the previous year that didn't get bred till, you know, December or January. So you're looking at, you know, those fawns that are born in July, August, you know, or even September on a rare occasion. You know, those are the ones that just don't have the resources to put up much for antlers their first year, because they're looking at growing antlers when they're like 9 months old or something. You know, if they're born in September and they start growing antlers in June, you know, they're only 9 months old. Whereas, you know, that fawn that was born in April, you know, when he looks at putting, you know, when the sun and his hormones are telling him to start growing antlers next June, he's over a year old. You know,
Good
so
point.
they've just got different resources that they can invest in antlers.
I'm guessing it's the same thing when you hear the term super button pop up every once in a while. The button bucks that, you know, you got ones that have the little itty bitty cap,
polished,
and then others that you can actually see, a couple inches of growth. Probably date of birth.
Yeah, that's going to be a large part of it.
And that's one of the neat things. I think that we kind of forget that these are long-lived species when it comes to a lot of game animals, and it takes them a while to go through. It's not just like fawn and all of a sudden they're adults.
Yeah.
You know, you come December, January, they some of them are that size, some of them aren't. Some of them are still added to it. Yep. So, all right, I think that covers quite a bit here. We're going to have to get you back in sometime and talk a little bit more. And
let me wander around.
Yeah, exactly. Don't forget to enjoy some more of that ice cream birthday cake that's out there. I don't know whose birthday it is in the office, but
happy birthday.
Exactly.
If you're listening.
Again, folks, make sure you give us a subscribe so you know when the next episode of Hunt Nebraska drops, and we appreciate you listening to us.
Hunt Nebraska, brought to you by your Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.